Everyone, I'm so pleased to have you come join us tonight with Bryan Hamilton. This is going to be a really special evening. I'm very excited for this presentation because Bryan is just so knowledgeable. He's a one of a kind. So I'm very excited that he can share with everyone tonight. Before we begin, I just want to introduce myself and the foundation. My name is Aviva O'Neill. I'm program manager of Great Basin National Park Foundation. We are the nonprofit partner of Great Basin National Park, and we do a lot to help the park with education and outreach. We provide interns for the park. We help provide funds for wayside exhibits and do a lot of work with schools. And we do a lot around the Dark Sky Initiative at the park because Great Basin is located in an amazing location that has some of the darkest skies in the contiguous United States. So we've built the Great Basin Observatory, and that allows students to do research remotely from many other places where there's a lot of light pollution. Anyways, I hope that if you have never heard of us, that you might check us out later. I will send out an email tomorrow with a recording of this webinar so you can share it with your friends or whatever you might want to do with it. But I'll also have some links in that email. There might be some links that Bryan gives me to share out, and I'll share out a few links for visiting the Great Basin National Park Foundation website and the Great Basin Observatory website. We have one more of these lectures, which will be next month. They've been taking place the first Wednesday of each month, and this is our fourth one. So they really have been great. So if you've missed any of the other ones, we have those all recorded, and I will share a link for those as well. And the reason we are doing this is our first time doing this kind of virtual lecture series. And we're doing it to really celebrate and share Great Basin National Park with the public, and specifically to honor, it's the centennial this year of Lehman Cave's National Monument. So a really special celebration, and if you happen to be able to come in person to the park, there's going to be a very fun day on August 6th at the park. You can learn more information about that on either the park's website or on ours, but everyone is invited to come and celebrate on August 6th. And that's all I have for my introduction. So I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to, oh wait, sorry, just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to just say that if anytime you have a question during this program, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A. We will get to questions at the end of the program, and feel free to put it in there at any time. And the chat, I know that Bryan's going to ask some questions to the audience, so we'll use the chat for that for and you can also throw questions in the chat. We'll try to figure them out, sort through them at the end of the program. But that's it. Now I'm going to hand it over to Bryan, and thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Aviva. I really appreciate it. You guys good on the sound? All right. Good. Share my screen here and get started. Okay. Is that working?
Yes, it looks good.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, before I started, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. In Great Basin National Park and the whole Great Basin and the area where I did all this work is the ancestral homeland of the Ely and Duckwater Shoshone, the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute, and the Indian Peak Paiute. And they've lived here and taken care of the land for thousands of years and continue to do so. And it's thanks to their stewardship that I'm able to do a study like this. So the species I work with is Great Basin Rattlesnake. And these snakes are, their scientific name is Crotalus lutosus, and they're distributed in the Great Basin. Kind of their range is between the Wasatch Mountains to the east, the Sierra Nevada to the west, Columbia Plateau to the north, and the Mojave Desert to the south. And I've been fortunate enough to work with these snakes for about 20 years, and I've been able to work with rattlesnakes in general for over 30 years. So I just kind of want to share some of my experiences and some of the things I've learned and kind of show you how we do this research. And my hope is that after this presentation, if you don't maybe share my love of rattlesnakes, at least maybe you'll have some more appreciation and some respect for these pretty amazing animals. And I'll make this PowerPoint available if anybody wants it. My contact information is over here and my Twitter. And I do want to thank the National Park Service for letting me do this research for a long time. Working with venomous animals isn't always popular from a safety perspective. So they've given me a lot of leniency there. And also Aviva and the Great Basin National Park Foundation for giving me this opportunity. So rattlesnakes are kind of this very uniquely American animal. They showed up on some of the early Revolutionary War flags. And believe it or not, rattlesnakes are native to all 48 of the contiguous states in the country. And there's really two groups of rattlesnakes. There's two genera, and one of those is Cistrurus, and there's only 3 species in that group. The big group by far is Crotalus, and most rattlesnakes are in this genus, which has 40 species. They can kind of be differentiated by some of the head scalation is the biggest way to tell those two apart, but there are other ways too. And the Crotalus includes the biggest rattlesnake in the world, the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, which has been recorded at over 8 feet in length. In the fossil record, snakes up to 12 feet have been seen. And also the smallest group, the smallest species, the Pygmy rattlesnake, rarely reaches 2 feet in length, and it's in the genus Cistrurus. And these two species largely share their distribution. They're found in the same area. And like a lot of animals, rattlesnake diversity increases as you get closer to the equator. So in Washington State, for example, there's only 1 species of rattlesnake. In Nevada, there are 6. In Arizona, over 15. But when you get to Mexico, there are over 30 species of rattlesnake. So the Southwest, and particularly Mexico, is kind of the cradle of rattlesnake diversity. So there are a lot of species out here. And that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about working in the Southwest. So for example, in a place like Las Vegas, there's 5 or 6 species within a relatively short distance of that city. And that's true of other metro areas in the Southwest too. Just really high rattlesnake diversity. And rattlesnakes are they can have really distinct patterns and coloration. On the left is a banded rock rattlesnake that's just really a beautiful colored snake. And then on the right, that's a black-tailed rattlesnake, which has this really intricate pattern, which may have inspired some of the Native American beadwork that you see. But these snakes are more than just a pretty face. Rattlesnakes almost exclusively eat small mammals, particularly rodents. And they feed on these animals, and rodents aren't really good for humans. So they kind of have these positive effects on ecosystems where they eat these rodents, and many of these rodents are vectors for diseases like Lyme disease, hantavirus, and bubonic plague. And this is a timber rattlesnake feeding on a vole back in the eastern US. And if you look at the distribution of timber rattlesnakes in that upper right corner, you'll notice their distribution overlaps quite a bit with white-footed mice and deer mice, but also with Lyme disease, which is a pretty major disease, zoonotic disease that humans get. And these zoonotic diseases are a big deal. The COVID-19 was almost certainly a spillover from animals into humans. And almost all the big diseases that humans have gotten have actually come from the animal kingdom, these zoonotic diseases. So by regulating prey like mice and indirectly with ticks and diseases, rattlesnakes are really beneficial to people. But rattlesnakes are venomous, and that venom is evolved primarily to deal with their mammalian prey. They've got these venom glands, and then they have these fangs that let them inject the venom, kill the rodent prey. And a rattlesnake, although it's very rare, a rattlesnake is capable of killing an adult human. And envenomations can be very seriously. An envenomation is a major medical emergency and requires a lot of hospital care. But it's very treatable today. But people, we're not very good at estimating risk. One thing I really learned during the pandemic is how bad humans are at risk assessment. And this definitely applies to snakes. There's some evidence that the evolution of our eyes and our brains were partly related to our ability to detect venomous snakes and protect us from those potentially fatal animals. So we're sort of co-evolved with these venomous snakes, and we have this pretty deep evolutionary relationship with them that often, I think, causes us to overreact. But in the United States, at least, that risk of snake bite is very, very low. For example, in 2009, there were over 7,000 reptile bites reported to some of the poison control centers. Of those, 5,000 were venomous snake bites. 1,200 of those were rattlesnake bites, but there were only 3 fatalities. You're really much higher risk of being killed by things like bees, white-tailed deer, lightning, and weather-related events than venomous snakes. And to further add to this, most rattlesnake bites are preventable. And by preventable, I mean that about half of rattlesnake bites are what we call illegitimate bites, meaning the person was trying to deliberately interacting with the snake. And there's a very specific demographic that is likely to get bit by rattlesnakes. These are young males, usually in their 20s, often under the influence of alcohol, trying to catch or kill that rattlesnake, and they're usually bitten on the hand. So by simply walking away from rattlesnakes, we could cut the instance of bites and probably fatalities in half just by not interacting with these animals at such close proximity. On the other hand, rattlesnakes have a lot to fear from humans. And even out here in the very remote Great Basin, people deliberately killing rattlesnakes is probably the biggest factor in their mortality. Although accidental mortality from roads is also a really big cause of death for rattlesnakes. And that sort of legacy goes back a long time in our colonial history, in that folks were really trying to eradicate rattlesnakes from big areas of the country at different times. And in many cases, they were successful at it, where they actually drove rattlesnakes to extinction in a lot of places. And in fact, in the eastern US, if you see the word rattlesnake in a place name, you can almost bet that there aren't rattlesnakes there now. Luckily, out in the western US, rattlesnake place names still often hold rattlesnakes. And that attempt to eradicate, while it's mostly gone away, it still happens at these events called Rattlesnake Roundups, which are mostly in Texas right now, where thousands of rattlesnakes are brought into these arenas for these festivals. The snakes are killed, really treated badly, and it's kind of this spectacle of death where the rattlesnakes are killed, basically. But in spite of that, the bigger threats to rattlesnakes are a little harder to see, in that development, such as urbanization, agriculture, have the bigger effect on these populations where the habitat is completely taken away. And when that happens, there's no potential for snakes to recover. And you kind of overlay on top of this the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is driving global warming. And that sort of sets the stage for how I've worked with rattlesnakes over the last few years. And what I've come to kind of realize fairly recently is that most conservation problems aren't really limited by research or science or biology. They're primarily social issues. So some of these big issues we're wrestling with, like climate change and global warming, we know what to do. It's just a question of how do we get society to take it on and make these changes. And it's true of big things like water use in the Western US. It's also true of smaller issues like wild horse management in Nevada. These conservation issues tend to be really social issues, and working with people is more important often than actually working with the animals. And that comes as a surprise, I think, to a lot of wildlife biologists that really got into this field to study animals, to realize that these are actually people problems and you need to work with people. So my kind of goal has been with rattlesnakes has been to try to get less people to have less killing rattlesnakes and more coexistence. So stepping back at a respectful distance. And so I try to engage and communicate as much as possible. And I really appreciate everybody participating in this and taking an hour out of your evening to try to learn from me. And I really try to learn from everybody too. So questions and things are really, it's really important part of this is interacting with folks. So I'm gonna have some questions that'll pop up here. And if you want to put the answer to those questions in the chat, after this presentation, I will go through the chat and I'll kind of randomly select some folks and we'll try to get a hold of you and maybe send you some cool pictures of stickers of these Great Basin rattlesnakes that are all local to Great Basin National Park. They're some of the, I think their coloration is, of all the rattlesnakes, they're definitely one of the most variable and beautifully marked. So the first question, if you'll put that in the chat, are rattlesnakes scary? And they're sort of are made to be scary. They have this rattle, and the function of that rattle is to scare away potential predators. So the rattle is designed as a way to warn something, hey, and keep in mind the rattlesnakes have the hardware to back up that warning. They have the venom glands that you can see on the side of their face, and they have the fangs that can inject that venom. And they are a very dangerous animal to predators. So in that sense, they seem kind of scary. And they're sort of, that's their intention with rattling, is to scare you away. But they also kind of have scary eyes. A lot of people comment on the eyes. And they don't look happy like this emoji. They kind of look angry. They got that scowl. And it's a permanent scowl by those supraocular scales that cover their eyes. Kind of makes them look mean and angry, even when they're not. It's just kind of the way they are. So that gives them kind of another element of kind of being scared. Being scary. So my next question is, how do rattlesnakes reproduce? If you could put that in the chat. What I'll do is kind of randomly go through and try to find some people that answered them. You don't have to get the answers right, just participate, and we'll try to send some of these stickers out. So rattlesnake, if you don't learn anything else during this presentation, rattlesnakes reproduce very slowly. That's a key life history trait that they have. Female rattlesnakes don't reach maturity until they're probably 5 to year, depending on the species. For Great Basin rattlesnakes, they reach maturity about 5 to 8 years old, and they don't reproduce every year. They probably reproduce every 3 to 5 years. So they reproduce late in life, and then they go long intervals without reproducing. And if you stack on top of that, the fact that they don't have very big litters, they have maybe 5 to 10 young per reproductive event. They're very slow at reproducing. And rattlesnakes, like about a third of all snakes, are what we call viviparous. And this is a video of rattlesnakes giving live birth. Viviparous means that they have live young rather than laying eggs. And it was kind of surprising to me how many snakes are actually viviparous like this. And so they have these live young. The young are born, and they have this membranous material around them. And they have this little tooth that they use to kind of cut their way out of that membrane. And they also have a little bit of nutrients left over from their mom that kind of helps them feed for a week or two. And in fact, a lot of these rattlesnakes, which are born, right around the 1st of September, the babies probably don't feed before they go down for hibernation later that month. And I've got a link to this video at the end of this, so if you want to watch this on YouTube, you can finish the whole video. Watch a few of these babies being born. And I think rattlesnake babies are really cute, but also rattlesnakes are really good mothers. After the babies are born, they stay with their young for about a week or two, and they protect them from predators. And they've even been observed sort of herding the babies back under these rocks where they give birth. And they give birth at places called rookeries. And this is a place where a number of female rattlesnakes will gather to give birth. They're often protected from predators here, and they also have thermally, they need the right temperatures to maximize the developing young. And then once the babies shed their skin, they follow their mom back to their winter den, and we call these maternal lineages. So generation after generation of rattlesnake has kind of followed this pattern. And early in my career as a scientist, I was kind of admonished not to anthropomorphize my study animals. It's almost an insult to another scientist to say you're anthropomorphizing, giving human-like traits to your study animal. But this was kind of bad advice. A lot of us that get in this field we're into it because we have this emotional connection to these animals. And that connection is kind of very relevant for conservation. I've always been more interested in the animals that were kind of, the underdogs like snakes, lizards, and bats that don't get a lot of respect, that kind of get picked on by people. And you can really see that in conservation, where the more charismatic, warm and cuddly animals get a lot more attention from conservation. And I kind of wanted to share with you an experience where I sort of threw out that admonishment to not anthropomorphize my study animals. I learned something kind of special and had an emotional connection with this rattlesnake that forever changed the way I viewed him. So this is a map of Gray Cliffs and Baker Creek Road. And the few black dots there are a place where, for my PhD work at Brigham Young University, we caught a gravid or pregnant female rattlesnake and implanted a radio transmitter in her. And that all went just fine. We took her back to her rookery, released her. There's several rattlesnakes in there that were going to give birth. She had her babies, and then she went back to her winter den, is what that black line kind of shows. Now, giving birth is extremely energetically costly for these females. Remember what I said about them reproducing very slow? Well, one reason is they lose up to half their mass in one reproductive event. So a 300-gram rattlesnake can lose 150 grams, and they're extremely emaciated. They're literally at the edge of starvation. And so optimal foraging theory and some of these biological concepts would predict that these females should go out and they should feed and try to recuperate that energy loss so they can reproduce more in the future. But this female really surprised me. She emerged from her winter den and she went pretty much immediately back to that rookery. Keeping in mind, she's on the verge of starvation, and she stopped and spent a few days in that rookery before she went out and foraged across this Baker Creek area, presumably catching mice and successfully hunting. And then in the fall, the cycle is they go back to their winter hibernacula. But on the way back, she stopped in again at that rookery site before she eventually went back to her den. We might have pulled her radio transmitter there at the end of that. And it just got me thinking, well, why would this snake do that when I know the cost of reproduction is so high? There's really no biological reason for it. But I really realized these snakes are enormously social animals. They actually seem to enjoy each other's company. They like to hang out. And so I kind of feel like she was just kind of stopping in to say hi to her fellow mothers. And maybe her offspring are there too. So that I thought that was a really sort of changing event for me. So my next question, what do they eat? If you could put that in the chat, remember, I'll send out some of these cool stickers to some folks that are participating in the chat. It's nice. I like these when there's a little more participation, and I thought this was a good way we could kind of have some interaction. So what animals eat is a really important aspect of their ecology and their conservation. And snakes practice what we call macrophagy, and they're gape-limited predators. And what that means is they eat really big things, and they have to swallow all their food whole. Different than us humans that we can chew our food. And a lot of people know that snakes can swallow really big things. You kind of hear that they unhinge their jaw. And that's, not quite accurate, not quite inaccurate. But folks are thinking the snake can, if this is a snake mouth, that they unhinge their jaw this way. And that's not completely true. They actually have this very complicated skulls and jaw structure. And they can open it pretty wide this way. So that is part of the equation. But what's really allowed snakes to eat such big meals is that their lower mandibles, if you think of this as your lower mandibles, your lower jaws, our jaws are fused like this. So we can only move our jaw up and down. And most animals are, in fact. But snakes, what happened when snake evolution is there was liberation of the mandibular symphysis. So these jaws are no longer fused, and those lower jaws can move independently and also open up. So those are the factors that let snakes eat really big things. And rattlesnakes and vipers really take that to the extreme. Their jaws are kind of these loose, configuration of bones that can stretch and move. They're held together by ligaments, but they can really open up to eat really big things. And of all the snakes, vipers and rattlesnakes are capable proportionally of eating the biggest prey. This is a western diamondback that is swallowing a cottontail rabbit. It's a really big meal, and energetically, this is probably enough food to meet that snake's basal calorie needs for an entire year. So it lets them get by on very infrequent big meals. And some vipers have been observed with food items in them 130% of their own mass. So they can eat more, not only just up to their own weight, but more than their own weight. And another way to think about this is Joey Chestnut. He's recognized as the #1 competitive eater in the world, considered the greatest of all time at hot dog competitive eating. Joey's about 200 pounds. And if you think about it, for him to eat his complete mass, that would mean him eating about 800 quarter-pound hot dogs. It's a crazy amount. But even Joey can't get anywhere near that. The world record that he holds is 71 hot dogs in 10 minutes. So a snake could eat 10 times that. Proportionally, it could eat up 10 times that amount. It's wild to think. 700 hot dogs. That's what these snakes are doing kind of every day, and it's just part of their basic life history. And snakes are really set up rattlesnakes are made to eat these rodents, this mammal prey. They've got a lot of cool adaptations that help them to hunt these rodents. They're nocturnal, which is really remarkable when you consider that they're an endotherm and they metabolically can't regulate their own body temperature very well. So they're immediately making a trade-off with temperature regulation because that's when the mice are active. And they also have these vertical pupils, which are designed to help see at night. And they have these heat-seeking pits, which even in total darkness, they can detect the warmth from a rodent extremely accurately and precisely, and accurately strike these moving rodents in complete darkness. And on top of that, they have the venom glands and the fangs to deliver the venom so that they can strike the rodent, inject the venom, the rodent runs off and dies, the snake tracks it down and swallows it whole. So that reduces a lot of the risk in terms of these rodents can bite really hard and snakes have no limbs to defend themselves. So it really reduces the risk, and it starts digesting them from the inside out so they can more efficiently feed. Rattlesnakes, almost all of them are what we call ambush predators. And what they do is they find a likely place, probably based mostly on scent, where rodents are moving around, say a log or a travel way or a burrow, and they'll set up an ambush here. And then when that rodent runs by, they can strike it, release, let the rodent go off and die, and then they can go feed on it. Very efficient predators. And when rattlesnakes are young, they generally feed on different things as they age, and we call that an ontogenetic change. So when they're young, they tend to eat lizards, so they have a different venom composition than as they grow and get bigger, and they switch to feeding more on warm-blooded prey like chipmunks and things. And this has kind of led. So next question is, are baby rattlesnakes more dangerous than adults? And I won't spend a ton of time on this, but part of the reason this, this is one of those myths that has some basis in truth. So their venom of the young snakes tends to be more potent drop for drop than the venom of the adult snakes. And so part of the reason that this idea has been so well accepted is part of that ontogenetic change in venom composition. It also really has no practical use, because if you ever get to pick which rattlesnake bites you, you always want to pick the smaller one. And that's not a decision that anybody ever gets to make. So what do they eat? They love these small mammals. They really like voles, pack rats. There's kind of this daredevil mouse in this lower right-hand corner that's jumping right by a rattlesnake in ambush posture. This is kind of the bread and butter. This is what makes Great Basin rattlesnakes go, are these mammalian prey that they can swallow whole. So the next question, well, what eats them? If you could put some of those answers in the chat. More things eat Great Basin rattlesnakes than I would have thought going into some of these studies. Things like California king snakes, which are ophiophagus, snakes that eat other snakes, really like to kill and eat rattlesnakes. And in fact, this king snake is probably not even big enough to swallow this Great Basin rattlesnake, but it sure is capable of killing it. Other predators of Great Basin rattlesnakes, I was surprised to learn that spotted skunks were a major predator of these rattlesnakes, and that spotted skunks are pretty small. They're about the size of a house cat, maybe a medium-sized house cat, and they're very capable. This is a really big Great Basin rattlesnake that this spotted skunk was able to kill and completely remove its head. Other predators include things like coyotes, foxes, raptors like hawks and owls, and falcons. These are all kind of some of the predators of Great Basin rattlesnakes. Badgers are another big predator in certain areas. But people, again, natural mortality can happen. Every year I see a couple rattlesnakes that have froze to death at these winter dens. Sometimes they drown. Sometimes they die of accidental rock falls. But people killing them is the big factor. Often they're killed on roads, either accidentally or on purpose, or people kill them for their skins and their rattles. Next question is, how long do you think Great Basin rattlesnakes live? I've been studying these snakes for about 20 years, and I think my study's kind of starting to catch up to their maximum age. But every year I find more and more snakes that are at least 20 years old. So I don't know that we've reached the upper limit to know how long some of these snakes can live. In New York, a guy named Bill Brown has been studying timber rattlesnakes since the early 80s, and he documented a female that was over 50 years old. So these snakes can live a long time. And their annual survival, this is a plot of annual survival over time, it does fluctuate based on the year, and you could think that that could be related to drought, it could be related to predation, but it hovers right around about 80%, which is very, very high survival for a snake. Another way to look at this is these young of year. These are the babies that were born in September. They made it through a full winter. They tend to survive at a much lower rate, but once they get it through their first year and they gain some size, they survive at a pretty similar rate to adults, which is right around 80%. They're very vulnerable. They only weigh about 10 grams when they're born, versus an adult rattlesnake, Great Basin rattlesnake, can be 500 or 600 grams. So they literally order of magnitude of growth. And in that first year, they're just really vulnerable to predators and probably starvation too. How do I study them? You could put these answers in the chat, and I'll kind of give you some background on this. I'm going to show you, I have a captive rattlesnake, and I want to show you firsthand how we actually study them. But Great Basin rattlesnakes, they're really nice to study because they aggregate at these communal dens to spend the winter. And these are those maternal lineages I was kind of talking about. And year after year, they have very high site fidelity. So they go back year after year after year. And there's a few weeks in the spring where they're sort of vulnerable. They're waking up from hibernation, and they're really easy to catch. So those factors let me catch a lot of rattlesnakes each year and also recapture those same individuals over different years. And in the spring, they kind of make these big cuddle piles of snakes where they stack on top of each other and they kind of lay around in the sun, and they're sort of lazy. And then I and some other biologists sometimes come to those dens, and we really ruin their day by catching them. We grab them, take them back to the lab, process them, measure them, weigh them, and most importantly, we inject a chip called a pit tag under their skin. And these are the same kind of chips that go into dogs and other animals. And then when we catch them again, we can scan them and we can see what individual that is. This is called a capture mark recapture study. And we learned some cool stuff with this. I've had thousands of captures, probably tagged over 1,000 individuals in these over the 20 years of this study. And remember what I said about, if you only remember one thing, remember rattlesnakes reproduce slow. And because they reproduce slow, they have to live a long time. So this is called a life history trade-off. Usually you only get to do one thing well, and the other things have to take a sacrifice to it. So they live a long time, but they reproduce slowly. And survival is about 4 times more important to rattlesnakes than recruitment. Recruitment is a proxy for reproduction. It's how many young enter the population every year. And many individuals are at least 20 years old. And so what we say is that rattlesnakes are a K-selected species. And what do I mean by a K-selected species? The field of population biology, you kind of try to understand how do populations vary over time. That's basically it. And on the y-axis, you can think about this as abundance, and the x-axis is time. And this dashed line is called K, which equals carrying capacity. And that's the maximum number of individuals that an area can support. And rattlesnakes tend to live right around K. So we say they're a K-selected species. And you can contrast this with, this is called the rate of increase, that increase from 0 up to K. And that, you can think about that as a reproductive capacity. So kind of weedy species like cheatgrass or game birds, species that can really increase and they go through these boom and bust cycles are R-selected species. So rattlesnakes really live around that area of K, and they're more similar to things like grizzly bears or tigers or whales than they are to a lot of snake species that are more R-selected. So to kind of start wrapping up, this is kind of my view of what it's like to be a conservation biologist in the Anthropocene. We're kind of handed a squeegee and asked to kind of hold back the ocean. And a lot of times the species we work with aren't doing well. You can think about California condors, which are doing better, but they're still not doing well. And so we often have this doom and gloom message, and we're chronically depressed and sad and just, unhappy with the world. And we pass that message on. But I've got some good news in that these Great Basin rattlesnakes are doing pretty darn good. It's nice to study a species that isn't declining. And what we've learned from this study, this top line is called lambda, and that's population growth. And if lambda falls below 1, population goes down. If lambda is above 1, the population's increasing. And with these K-selected species, lambda tends to be right around 1. And conveniently, lambda is the sum, it's the additive effect of survival and reproduction. So if you add those two things together, how many animals lived plus how many you added to the population, that gives you your population. In principle, population biology is that simple, although in practice, it's a lot more challenging. And these snakes have hovered right around 1 over the course of this study. They have good years and they have bad years, but they hover right around 1, which is what you'd expect for a K-selected species. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to kind of watch coexistence with rattlesnakes change over my career. Folks, when I first started, killing rattlesnakes was pretty much the standard way to deal with them, whether they were in your yard or you just came across them. That's what people did, is they killed rattlesnakes. And more folks either want to move the rattlesnakes or they want to maybe even just let the rattlesnake stay there. So that's been a really positive thing that I've been able to see over the last 30 years. And there's been some really proactive groups that have tried to help people coexist with rattlesnakes. Brian Hughes at Rattlesnake Solutions moves snakes and helps people snake-proof their houses. And Emily Taylor with Central Coast Snake Services also does this service in California. Rattlesnake Solutions is in Arizona. So the conservation is catching up with, it's meeting the need that people want to protect these snakes. And so what I'd like to encourage you is, if you're fortunate enough to see a rattlesnake out in nature, out in the field, take some time to enjoy it, to appreciate it. Even though rattlesnakes might seem a little bit scary, if you just step back and give them a little bit of space, you can often observe them safely for you and the snake, and you can learn a lot by observing them. And what you'll probably notice is rattlesnakes always try to get away from people. They're not aggressive animals. They never attack people. That's the last thing they want to do, is interact with a big, scary hominid. So if you watch them, even these really big rattlesnakes might be curious, but they'll always turn around and go the other way if you just give them a place. And if you can stay about 6 feet back from any rattlesnake in North America, their strike range is effectively about half their body length. So if you give any rattlesnake in North America about a 6-foot distance, you can safely stand back, you can observe it, you can get all the pictures you want, and you really can learn a lot about these really marvelous animals they're really sentient beings. They're gentle, they're social, and I hope you can kind of see that view if you see them in the nature. It's special to see a rattlesnake in the wild. It's always a good day for me when that happens. So I'd like to acknowledge a few people that have really helped me with this project. I couldn't have done this alone. These surveys take a long time, and I've had some really great help and some really good support. Some folks have even given me money to do this. So thanks to everyone who's helped me. And with that, I'd like to show this rattlesnake, and then we can take some questions. All right, cool. So the way we study these snakes, once they're captured, if I can get them to go into this is called a squeeze box. And this is how we measure them. They go in the squeeze box, and then we trace them. And then you get them to go into a plastic tube so you can handle them. So I'm gonna, content warning, there's gonna be a live snake, which you probably knew when you showed up. But I'm gonna get this guy out and we'll measure. So this is a snake I've had in captivity for almost 15 years. And this is a really big rattlesnake for the Great Basin. They get a little bigger than this, but not much. Let's see if I don't know how well you guys can see that, but I'll flip it up to show you. So then we trace his outline. And then this way the snake can't bite me, and I can't hurt it. So it's a good way to handle them. It's really the greatest thing for snake handling. And now I'll get him to go into his tube. And then we can look at him a little closer. Yeah, so you can I could show you the rattle up close, which is kind of cool. This rattle's a modified scale, and every time they shed, they gain a new rattle segment. So it's correlated with their growth, but you can't determine the exact age because they break off and sometimes they shed more than once a year. That's a really long rattlesnake, that rattle for a cap. It's because he's a captive snake. And then, let's see if we can get another. I'll try to get you a good look up close at his face, and then we can take some questions. See if I'll go through for us. This guy gets measured a lot, and he's gotten pretty used to being in captivity. So you can kind of see his face up there. And this is sort of the last thing a mouse is ever going to see, is this, maybe the business end of a Great Basin rattlesnake. Squeeze out. Get him to poke his head out a little bit. There we go. Now you can get a really good look at his venom gland, or his pits and venom glands. You can see the eye up real close, and you probably can see him tongue flicking there. So doing this, he's testing the air, smelling. It's like, what's up with this computer screen? If I can get the focus right, you kind of see those pits. Really, you can really see how the pits are aligned, kind of like eyes, and the pits face forward, so they can see in they get a lot of perspective. They can detect depth perception. They can do a lot of depth perception with that. And I think they're really handsome snakes. That video of the snake having babies this snake was born in that litter. He was one of those snakes. Yeah, so maybe we could do questions now. Not sure what the best way to do that is, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
Sure, and I can help with that and read them off. I'll read off the questions to you. So thank you so much, Bryan. I knew this was going to be very interesting and entertaining, and we definitely got both of those. So wonderful, lots of great participation and a ton of questions. So I think I'm just going to go from the top here. Which is the most dangerous snake? Someone wants to know, is it the green Mojave or the Great Basin?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trying to get myself. Well, so it's a good question. No snakes are dangerous. Rattlesnakes are dangerous unless they bite you. So the only way they're dangerous is if they can bite you and inject venom. And we often think of venom toxicity as kind of a proxy for how dangerous a snake is. And snakes have different types of venom. Mojave rattlesnakes tend to have a more neurotoxic venom, like I mentioned with the young that feed on lizards. So Mojave rattlesnakes have super small heads. And so maybe to compensate for that, they have a more toxic venom. So Mojave rattlesnakes are arguably the most toxic venom in North America. Great Basin rattlesnakes are right in the middle. Not toxic enough, but not at the high end.
A question is, do the babies bite one another when they're in those dens?
Good question. They don't bite one another. And in fact, the snakes never bite each other. Male rattlesnakes fight as a form of combat for females. I wish I had the video. And rattlesnakes never bite each other. They do sometimes bite each other when they're really freaked out because I'm catching them. They're just striking at things. And sometimes they'll even bite themselves. But out on their own, they never bite each other. It's kind of neat.
There's a question about if when they're digesting stuff, do they digest all of the bones? Or is there anything that they regurgitate?
They don't. They have extremely potent gastric juices, and they actually can turn their digestive system on and off. So our digestive system, and we're constantly maintaining it. If snakes aren't feeding, they kind of switch it off. But then when they switch it on, it's super powerful, and they digest everything. Hair doesn't digest well. Sometimes you'll find teeth in their feces. But the bones kind of get completely dissolved, and they're this white mass that's part of their feces.
And a question about their venom. Someone wants to know, can you offhand say what kind of toxins are in their venom?
It's tricky, and the more we learn about venom, the more complex we realize it is. There's kind of been this paradigm that there were neurotoxins and myotoxins and hemotoxins. So the idea was different components affect different parts of an animal's systems. And a neurotoxin would affect your brains. You can think about like cobras. People bitten by cobras, they often die, but the cause of death is respiratory failure. There might not be any tissue damage or necrosis. Whereas rattlesnake bites often do a lot of tissue damage, and it takes a long time if people do die from it. So that's kind of the classic way that we split them up. The more we learn how much variation there is, and there's a lot of mixing. Those concepts are still pretty useful. And there's a really cool paper called Toxicity versus Tenderizers. And the idea is like, do you want to be very toxic and knock your prey down really quick and kill it, like the young rattlesnakes do with lizards? Or do you want to go ahead and start pre-digesting it? And so that's been a useful paradigm thinking about venom evolution.
Next question is about if you could describe how they mate.
Yeah, I wish I should have put a video in it. So it's kind of cool. The males fight bigger. One reason males want to get bigger is they can fight off other males and they can mate with more females. And rattlesnakes are sexually dimorphic. Almost all of them are. And in Great Basin rattlesnakes, if it's a snake as big as the one we just looked at it, I bet a lot of money it's a male. So the females put all that energy into reproduction. And so they kind of stop growing in length effectively once they reach maturity. Instead, they're kind of growing in girth, and they're putting on weight and losing weight with reproductive events, whereas the males just get bigger, bigger, bigger. But the way they mate is males have a forked penis called a hemipenes, and you can kind of think about it like this. It's a paired penis. And the male they kind of line up their vents. I could have showed you that on that snake if I still had it out. And then the male inserts his hemipenes, and the female actually stores the sperm. So right now is peak mating season for rattlesnakes. The female stores the sperm, hibernates with it, and actually in the next year after leaving hibernation, she ovulates and becomes pregnant. And then that whole reproductive cycle starts. So it's kind of a complex, and it's also disjointed time with that sperm storage.
This question, I think, is maybe follows well with the mating, because I don't know if this is about males or if this is about mating. But when you see two rattlesnakes that are kind of like standing up and like intertwining their bodies, and are they
Yep.
Are they competing? Are the males competing? Are they like a male and a female doing like a dance? Or explain that.
Dance. Cool. That's a great question, because it kind of looks similar. When they're kind of going up, like intertwining like that and fighting, that's usually a fight. That's the males fighting. I wish I'd have put that video in there. If you look up combat dance on YouTube, there's lots of really cool videos. And bigger males always win those fights. It's kind of like heavyweight boxers. But if the males are the same size, they can fight for hours and hours and hours. When they're mating, they tend to be flat on the ground. Their tails are often like wrapped around each other a little bit. Sometimes the males push their head on the female and kind of do this rubbing thing, part of the courtship. So they're similar but different. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, I think definitely. Another question is, one attendee has heard that rattlesnakes are starting to evolve without rattles. And is there any evidence of this?
That's a great question. And that's kind of like one of the, like the baby rattlesnakes being dangerous, that, I don't want to say myth, but that viewpoint. So first off, there are some rattlesnakes that don't have rattles. They evolved a rattle and they subsequently lost it. Pygmy rattlesnakes, a lot of them don't, the rattle's effectively non-functional and it falls off a lot. There's some rattlesnakes on islands that don't have rattles. Another viewpoint, and arguably, like, maybe the rattle doesn't serve them, and so it's not needed, so there's not selection for it. But kind of the idea has been that rattlesnakes, maybe not so much they're losing their rattles, but they're losing they don't rattle. Because the ones that rattle get killed by people. So over time, we're selecting for rattlesnakes that don't rattle. And it's got a real nice scientific kind of hypothesis feel to it. But right now, it's just a hypothesis. We don't really have any evidence that that's occurring. What I think's happening is that we're learning more about rattlesnakes, and we're not trying to kill them. And so we're noticing more that they don't rattle. And if a rattlesnake isn't threatened, it usually doesn't rattle. It sits there and it'll rely on its crypsis, its camouflage, rather than attracting attention to it. When they're out in the open, they feel kind of vulnerable, they're more likely to rattle. So no evidence, but it's an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah, really makes very interesting. There's a question about if you're collecting genetic samples on the ones that you're studying.
So I have started doing that. I get blood from every individual. During COVID, I was able to help a grad student. I worked with her and sent blood, so she was able to use that for her master's thesis. So yeah, I am. And if anybody on this in need of genetic samples, I do have a nice collection of rattlesnake genetics in my freezer.
Another question here is if rattlesnakes are moving up in elevation with climate change, if you've seen that, and what is the max altitude or elevation that they're known to live at?
Yeah, that's a good question. The short answer is I don't know, but it would be consistent with climate change. Great Basin rattlesnakes, we found them all the way up to Wheeler Peak at 13,000 feet. So they don't really have any higher to go here. Having said that, in my area at least, above 8,000 feet, reptile and rattlesnake densities really drop off. You definitely can find them above that, even up to 10,000 feet. But it's a tough place to make a living for a rattlesnake. And you would expect, as climate change increases temperatures, that these higher elevations would be more favorable for rattlesnakes. But yeah, so yes and no, I guess, to that question. I don't think there's any empirical evidence showing that they've moved up, though.
So a couple of quick questions here. One is, do you, in your experience, do you think rattlesnake avoidance training for dogs is effective? And another question of, do they have to be coiled to strike?
So they don't have to be coiled to strike, but it's really hard when they're stretched out like this. They can't really strike. They can only bite, if that makes sense. When they're coiled up, they can actually strike. But again, they can certainly bite when they're stretched out. And if you notice, when they're crawling, a lot of times they'll reflexively coil up to put themselves in a better defensive position. I think rattlesnake avoidance training could be useful, but I've learned that they use venomoids for the training. So that's a surgery where they remove the fangs and the venom, so the snakes can't bite the dogs. And that's a really cruel thing to do to these animals. I can't even, it makes declawn cats look like, child's play. So that's sort of the trade-off. However, I think it probably is effective way to get dogs to avoid rattlesnakes, especially dogs. Some dogs have an aggressive reaction towards the rattlesnakes, and that's what the avoidance training. And dogs tend to get bit on the face and stuff. So those are just my thoughts. It probably is effective, but it's really cruel for the snakes.
Well,
Emily just said they don't use venomoids. Yes, and that seems like a great way to do it. Thank you.
I know we're just gonna, if you're up for it, Brian, we'll just keep going through the questions, and if anyone on the audience, I know it's a little bit after our hour, and you just feel free to leave when you need to. But if you're okay with it, Brian, we'll just keep going. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on for another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. So a question about, do all rattlesnake species have rookeries away from their winter dens?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would probably say it's not an absolute. I think a lot of these rookeries probably are at the winter dens. It's easier to study reproductive behavior in the eastern US because sunlight's limited because it's a closed canopy. So if you can find an open area, it has a really big draw for rattlesnakes, and it's really easy to find pregnant rattlesnakes. In the West, it's sort of the opposite problem, where a lot of places are too hot and there's no open areas. Every place is open and there's rocks everywhere. So I haven't been really great at studying them at rookeries out here. I think, it's one of those things that depends. A lot of rattlesnakes don't use rookeries. They just are out on their own and give birth. So there's a lot of variables in there. I think my system, it's kind of the paradigm, like this is how we think they should behave. And then the rattlesnakes kind of actually do their own thing. They don't read our papers always.
A question on the venom, wanting to know if it constantly regenerates, so that do they ever run out of their venom?
They can run out. It does constantly regenerate, but it's a slow process. So anti-venom is made with rattlesnake venom. And so there are groups, organizations that milk the rattlesnakes. There's maybe a handful of them in the United States. And so they can only milk that venom so many times, so frequently, because they have to let it go back. And that's one of the arguments. A lot of rattlesnake bites are what we call dry bites, where they bite, but they don't inject venom. And that's sort of the thought, is that venom's energetically expensive to produce, so the snakes don't want to waste it. And when they do inject, we think rattlesnakes can very precisely meter the venom based on, like, is it a big mouse or a small mouse? So yeah, all that stuff plays into it.
And in a dark environment like a cave, how far is the range of the heat receptors?
So I don't know exactly, but it's probably kind of like this, just like what's right directly in front of them. And I think their vision's kind of like that too. They don't seem to see well at distance. It's sort of, it's probably optimized really close within a pretty small radius. I don't know that for certain, but really, I'm going to say 10 feet's probably out of range. It's very anecdotal, but I think it's a pretty short distance.
What about the breeding season for the Great Basin rattlesnake? What time of year is that?
Yeah, it varies. We used to think most rattlesnakes kind of have this peak breeding season, middle of the summer, July, August. And I think there's some truth to that. Like my captive rattlesnakes will stop eating, especially the males stop eating in the summer, and then they just go wander. And I could see that with radio tag snakes too. They would just go on these big long distance movements. Having said that, nature's messy. People on the western side of the Great Basin see lots of mating in the spring, lots of mating, and that was not supposed to happen. On the other hand, I've never seen it at any of my spots, so maybe there's a lot more regional variation than we thought. And in Mexico, those snakes are meeting year-round. Just it's different. It's not it's almost tropical, and so their whole biology is very different than what we think of it up here in temperate North America. Mm-hmm. They reproduce every year. They're probably mating all the time. And that's where rattlesnakes evolved. So that maybe is the ancestral system, whereas we've really only studied them in North America.
A couple of questions on your captive snake. People are curious what you feed it, and also kind of if it has an outdoor habitat.
Yeah, I feed it frozen thawed rats. When it was younger, I fed it lizards and mice. I don't take it out very often. I've been trying to be more mindful of enrichment for rattlesnakes, but other than like training and things, I don't really get them outside much, which I feel guilty for. So I will try to give them more time outside in the future. We used to treat snakes like, we just put them in a small box. All they need is food. And that was kind of the environment that I learned snake husbandry in. But more and more we're learning snakes need enrichment too. And it's not good for them to just live in a little box all their lives. Who knew? Who would have thought?
Well, they're social creatures. That's what we learned tonight.
Yep.
Amazing and social creatures. So a question about, like, if you were out hiking and you were to be bit, what should you do?
Yeah, so I'm not a doctor and I'm not even an EMT anymore, but really the only medical care for rattlesnake bites is anti-venom. So what you want to do is people want to ask what the best first aid is for a rattlesnake bite, and it's your cell phone and your car keys. You want to get to a hospital as quickly as possible and get anti-venom. There's really not much you can do other than in the field other than like remain calm, and maybe there's some first aid measures, but you want to get to a hospital. The old saying used to be time is tissue. So the sooner you can get anti-venom, you're probably not going to die, so you can give yourself a little pep talk with that. But you do want to get anti-venom quickly and get assessed by a doctor as quick as possible. And it's not very satisfying, but even if you're in the middle of nowhere, that's still the best available way to treat a rattlesnake bite.
And are you supposed to tourniquet the area that?
So no tourniquets. Any first aid kits for snake bites are now not indicated. There used to be we called it the cut and suck method. People have used tourniquets. They would cut the bite. They try to suck the venom out with suction cups and things. And you still see those around. The old ones with the razor blades, and the newer ones are just like a hypodermic syringe that you put on a rattlesnake bite. None of those are indicated for rattlesnake bites. They either have no effect whatsoever, and actually they probably make the outcomes worse. So get to the hospital, call 911, start moving towards the hospital.
Okay, a couple more questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but I want to ask a few more here that are, I think, quite interesting.
Sure.
Personally, one of them is about snake navigation. So do you kind of know like what helps them figure out where you're traveling? And then the other one related to that is tracking their prey. So once they bit the prey and then it went off somewhere, how do they locate it? And do they ever, not find it?
It's a good questions. I don't know much about snake navigation. There's been quite a bit of work on it in other species. I do know that rattlesnakes they know every rock within their home range. They'll go to the same rock year after year out in the middle, and there's nothing that to me would indicate that this was a special rock. They communicate with pheromones a lot, and so that's we just don't use our sense of smell very much. And so rattlesnakes have this whole different way of communicating that it's really hard for us to perceive in the study. But they often, males have been observed, moving in a straight line, crossing the track of a female, and then just immediately changing direction and tracking her down. But there's other ways that they navigate in their home range that are probably different than that somehow they're perceiving their environment in this very, very intricate, detailed way. And you used to think if you relocate rattlesnakes too far outside their home range, they often get lost and wander. They don't know where they're at, and they're trying to find their home. And sometimes that can lead to their death. So now we use what are called short distance translocations, where you try to move them as little as possible to take that into account. As far as how do they track their prey, that's a little better in that they inject the venom and then they follow the scent trail. So there's some really cool work out there showing how their tongue flicks increase and how they're able to track their prey down. They certainly probably do not find their prey a lot. And like with birds, they often grab the bird and hold it rather than let it go because they know the bird's going to fly off and they can't track it down. This year I found a dead kangaroo rat in a rattlesnake den. I mean, I think it was probably envenomated and the snake hadn't fed on it. In hindsight, I should have just watched the kangaroo rat rather than picking it up. But yeah, so that's kind of, I think there's multiple ways they navigate scent and other ways too that we just don't know.
Well, I know we still have a few unanswered questions, but I think I'll send those to Bryan too, and we'll get them out to you by email because we do have your emails.
Okay.
But we'll end with one just fun question because it's good to end on a fun question, silly question, which is just, what is your second favorite reptile in the Great Basin?
Wow, that's a tough one. Rattlesnakes are definitely my favorite. Every day I see a rattlesnake, I'm just so happy. Never get tired of it. That's one of the things I love living here is that they're arguably the most common snake, and I can catch them 100 or 200 in a year and study them. And I love that. I really like Sonoran mountain king snakes. They're beautiful, but they take 40 to 80 hours to find. So they're really hard to find. And rubber boas are just amazing. Recently, with my kids, I've gotten more interested in lizards, and I can't really pick one, but horned lizards are amazing. Yeah, any reptile, I'm really happy. It's a tough place to make a living in the Great Basin. It's a cold, dry desert, and that's not a good place to be an ectotherm. So sorry I couldn't come up with a second.
Well, that was a great presentation. I think we have lots of people that said thank you in the chat, and I'm going to thank you one more time. Thank you so much. And I hope whoever is still with us tonight, come see the lecture next month, which is going to be another park biologist, and it's going to be the fish biologist. And we're going to learn about the Bonneville cutthroat trout, which is an incredibly interesting species as well. It has a really neat history and a lot to learn. So we'll see you next month. And thanks so much and good night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.